to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And I have a great guest this evening, someone I consider a friend, Donald Schmitt. And we were just talking ahead of the show. It's been a long time. Last time he was actually on my show was back in when I was in Phoenix. I think it was 2018. So I can't believe this much time has gone by. He's been on many times over the years. He's a great researcher. When it comes to the Roswell case, of course, he has spoken to many witnesses when they were alive. A very interesting guy. He worked with Paul Hynek years ago. I'm sorry, J. Allen Hynek, not Paul Hynek. Paul Hynek's his son, a great guy also. But he worked with J. Allen Hynek, and we're going to be talking about that and so much more. Really looking forward to having him on. And what about these drones? Everyone is writing me and sending me pictures, all these drone incursions all over the world, not just the U.S., but into military bases. I'm actually going to be on a couple different shows tomorrow. People want to talk about the drones. I don't know all that much about it. I've been pretty busy, but I'm going to do a quick study on that. And it'll be really interesting to figure out at least, what is going on with them. I do believe that no one really understands exactly what it is, but just where the drone incursions are happening anyway. I'll be talking about that tomorrow. If you want to follow Darcy Weir, I'm going to be on his show, and also on a gentleman named Jason out of Canada. I'm going to be on his show as well tomorrow. So the blog this week is John Keel's Methods and Madness, as presented in Anomaly number 1. That's our blog by Charles Lear. Check that out over at podcastufo.com. We also have merch if you're looking to give Christmas presents. We have a merchandise with T-shirts, cups, and water bottles, I think, stuff like that. And that's all on our website, podcastufo.com. I want to thank everyone that supports the show. There's a lot of you, and I do appreciate it. It really helps us pay the bills here and carry on and do things like we do, like go to Washington, D.C., stuff like that. Next week, I'm real excited because I have Ryan Graves is actually coming to my home, and we're going to be setting up. I'm setting up actually in my living room. Going to have a nice conversation with him next week. So that's right here, same time, next Tuesday. Really looking forward to that as well. But with no further ado, I'd like to bring in my wonderful guest and friend, Donald Schmitt. Don, welcome.
Martin, 6 years. My God. So
it's hard to believe, isn't it?
All before COVID, but then COVID, created a void in all of our lives.
That's right.
And that, so much of it was just getting through, that situation, and then recovering, and then rebuilding, and then coming back. So instead of 6, we'll say it was just 4. So.
Okay, yeah, everyone lost a few years there.
Everyone lost a few years, right?
And it's too bad. I love the UFO Congress, and it's on hold for right now. It's too bad that's not running. That was such a wonderful event in Phoenix area, and I loved the time of year. They switched it to summer, but it used to be in February when everyone wants to go there to get warm, and it was a beautiful time to have it, especially at the Wakapee. I'm trying to remember the Native American casino and that resort.
Well, I remember it's Fort McDowell.
That's right.
With the location, but as to this casino, and I know there was some conflict as far as that. There we were as either speakers or attendees, and the complaint was, well, we weren't frequenting the casino. So
yeah,
it was
is that what it was?
All that space, and we weren't, supporting, the franchise, so to speak. But but it was a wonderful venue. Yeah, many good memories, and especially the people, such as yourself.
That's right. Well, yeah, and I had one of the great stories I was told there was from a woman that worked at the casino. I mean, her sighting was incredible. She goes, "What's going on here?" I said, "UFOs," and then she told me this incredible story, which was really amazing. It was right up there into one of these crazy stories. It was basically just since I started talking about it, this thing came off a mesa. They were driving along a highway, and then it floated right over them and poured a light. This is daytime. Light came right down from this thing, right through their skylight in the car, and it was just like this thing right over she said it was something dark right over their car, and they sped up to 100 miles.
Oh,
yeah, sped up to 100 miles an hour, and the thing kept up with them. No cars coming either way. It was on this long, highway.
And then it makes you wonder if anything else happened.
Right. Well, listen to the end of the story. This is great because the end of the story goes, and she's telling me this. She goes, I've never really told anyone, this. And so she then it seemed to go off. And she says, and we pulled over to the side, and she said, all of a sudden, this owl, the biggest owl I've ever seen in my entire life, came right down right in front of the car. And I was like, what? So I called Michael, Michael. Yeah.
We've heard that more and more, the owl.
Yes.
Somehow being associated with this phenomenon. And it's something more current. It isn't like if you go back through the decades and there were, phantom dogs and owls and even Bud Hopkins, when he originally started, like there were often deer that were witnessed within the general area.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. Yeah, crazy. But anyway, for the person who's saying, who the heck is Don Schmitt? If you would, you have a great background. You've been researching for many, many years. But I don't know if I ever asked you this question. What was your first interest in this topic?
Dating back in high school. And I came about it rather serendipitously in that I already was an avid reader. I grew up with 5 brothers, no sisters. And unlike all my younger siblings, for Christmas, I'd always make out my Christmas list, which were all book titles. So from 6 years old, I was already, asking for books. And so I'm out Christmas shopping with mom and dad, and I wanted to go to the book section. And I'm just coming off of the Kennedy assassination, and I'm just coming off of the Warren report. And there was this book, and it's using the very words which were, predominantly describing the Kennedy investigation, which were whitewash and cover up. And it was on the jacket of this book, and it happened to be about flying saucers. And it was Frank Edwards' book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business. And through the years, I've learned that many of my colleagues, that was the book.
Wow.
That hooked them, because it covered every genre of the phenomena. It wasn't just lights in the sky. It wasn't just flying. The one chapter, for example, which was entitled "Who's Driving?" So it focused on occupant cases. And so you couldn't help but place yourself in the position of the witness and just imagining, my God, how would I have reacted? How would I behave? And I was just so captivated. And then my second book was the Coral and Jim Lorenzen book, Flying Saucer Occupants. So the whole book was about occupant cases from all around the world. And in the inner leaflet, it made the statement, the publisher made the comment, you may not believe every one of these accounts, but just imagine if one of them is true. And I forever, it was like, precisely, it's only going to take one that will just, once and for all reveal itself to being, the evidence that we all would require to demonstrate that we are being visited, that we are not alone, that there is life out there. And it's not so much that we would say, yeah, told you so, as much as now I can get on with the rest of my life because the race is over. We were part of, that revelation, that disclosure, as we like to use that word nowadays.
Yes. Yep. So what was, as far as you getting into CUFOS, as far as you getting, I'm saying, as far as you taking the topic more seriously, and, deciding you wanted to do some research, how did that all come about?
I first went into investigative training with the Area Phenomena Research Organization. I mentioned Coral and Jim Lorenzen, who were the founders and directors when they had relocated down in Tucson. And I would become their Wisconsin representative. And I had written up a report, and it circulated throughout some of the ranks, and who should have, stumbled upon it but the very foremost authority on the subject, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, former consultant to the Air Force Project Blue Book, founder of the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. And here I am, half hour northwest of Milwaukee, and Hynek and his center is just down in Evanston, about 2 hours away from me. And I received a phone call from his secretary at that time, inviting me not only to the center office, but to his residence.
Wow.
And it was like a dream come true, because we were just coming off of the Close Encounters movie that he had done with Steven Spielberg.
Yep.
And it was like, sitting at the foot of the master, so to speak. And he was so impressed with my case report that the next thing I know, he is sending me sightings here in Wisconsin and asking me to investigate them for him. And then one thing leading to another. And the next thing I know, there's a half a dozen of us that there was talk of, his boys, his special investigators. And the next thing I know, I'm one of them. And so the late John Timmerman, who was on the CUFOS board, they had a field examination test for all the investigators. And I'm at the Hynek residence one evening for dinner. And John is there. They had a board meeting that afternoon. And I arrived for dinner. And John is standing in there with Dr. Hynek. And John says, or he asks Dr. Hynek, Don didn't take the test. How come you didn't have Don take the test? And that perpetual wink, that twinkle that Hynek always had. He looks at John and he's got that expression and he goes, he could test me. And it was like, you talk about just being floored, just being totally floored. And then everything that transpired thereafter and being in the field with him and working with him. And I had mentioned before we signed on, Martin, how he would always make that comment, I'm an old man in a hurry, I'm an old man in a hurry. And it was like, come on, you're only in your late 60s. You hopefully have your best years ahead of you yet. And you have, those of us devoted and committed to assisting and helping you, solve this riddle. And then he would always, and it was after the infamous debate he had with the late Carl Sagan, the famous physicist of Cornell University. And I don't know why, if you would allow me to call Dr. Hynek Alan, because that's what I always called him, as he insisted. He'd call me Don, I called him Alan. And why he was so nervous over that meeting. And it was almost like he became Don Knotts. Like it was like the ghost of Mr. Chicken. Dr. Hynek, and he stood there at the podium and he literally shook as he was holding his paper. And then Sagan would come out afterwards and he would take the microphone from its stand and come to the front of the lectern and he would just lean on it and he did shtick for an hour. It was classic Carl Sagan, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson type of thing.
Yeah.
And it so affected him. And it really bothered me because no matter what case we'd be working on, he so often would remark, what will Carl say? What will Carl say? He was so afraid of what Sagan's, reaction or rebuttal or critique of, our work was going to be. And, but wow. It's not that affected me negatively, in as much as everything positive, as my mentor, as my scientific director, and as my dear friend, and the way he would school us as to, like he'd always would tell us, never lose that little boy wonderment. And I love that.
Yeah, that's great.
And here I am at the age I presently am, and there's no sign of me ever giving up on that. And then when his son Paul, when I was with him just a year and a half ago at the MUFON Symposium in Denver, and I remember Paul when he was just a young boy, and even at the Hynek residence, and I would just occasionally see him and his brother Paul, and really showing no interest in the subject at all, which was fine.
Yeah.
But I meant Joe, but Paul, but Paul, he remarks to me as I'm leaving, he goes, "I hope you know just how much my dad loved you."
Oh,
and it's like,
wow.
Yeah.
So I got to tell you a little quick story about.
Please.
So I lived in California. I was out there for 9 years, and I got involved. I was doing appraisals like I do now, and auctions and things. And a neighbor lived right near me, was former talk show host Tom Snyder.
Oh, yes.
And I got to meet him only a couple times, but I had good conversations with him, and I asked him what he thought about Dan Aykroyd, imitating him on Saturday Night Live. He said him and Dan were great friends. He loved it. And because he used to do that, ha, 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 ha.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So he passed away, unfortunately. He had cancer, leukemia.
Heavy smokers, I recall. Yeah,
I never saw him smoke, so he had given it up when I had met him a few times. But anyway, I did his estate appraisal and handled some things, but I became friends with his wife at the time, Pam Burke, still friends with her today.
Wonderful.
And so I contacted her about 5 years ago, and I said, by the way, because she was always interested, she's a producer of shows, many shows. And so I said, well, believe it or not, I'm doing a show on UFO. She goes, oh, I love it. She said, I got to tell you about Tom. Tom loved the topic. He loved J. Allen Hynek. He couldn't wait to get him on the show. Every time he was on, he would stay a long time. He said it was one of his favorite guests on the show.
Right.
Was J. Allen Hynek.
And I was witness to those shows, and he would have on our dear departed friend Stanton Friedman, and when NBC, which Snyder was also on, because he would follow Carson on the Tonight Show, and when the UFO Incident, which was the dramatization of the Betty Barney Hill case, and he had on Estelle Parsons, who I believe was the actress who played Betty Hill, and then he had Betty Hill on as well. So he loved the subject, but you are correct, Martin. He loved having Hynek on, because Hynek also was, a dear friend to friends of Tom's, like the drummer Buddy Rich, and the thing, and Jackie Gleason was a personal friend of J. Allen Hynek. And then we know the story, that of what supposedly happened with Gleason and President Nixon. And
what do you, since you know that story, first of all, I'm just going to pop up a little picture of Tom Snyder with John Lennon. That's with John Lennon there interviewing him.
Google it.
Yeah.
Google it. Yeah.
Yeah. But so what did Mr. Hynek think about, Dr. Hynek, think about Jackie Gleason's story and Nixon?
Well, unfortunately, by the time this came out, Dr. Hynek had already passed away, because he died in '86. And what's interesting is that if you remember ABC news commentator, the late Paul Harvey, and the rest of the story and the thing is he would do his daily newscasts.
Good day.
The voice. And after Hynek passed away, and I was on the board of directors at the Center for UFO Studies, and I was serving as director of special investigations, and the board asked me to then repeat what Hynek had been doing. And I was meeting with Harvey on a yearly basis and briefing him, updating him on the present UFO situation. So we get word, we finally learned of this, story. through one of Gleason's former wives, that she had written this in unpublished manuscript about how Gleason and then President Nixon were dear friends, both on and off the golf course, but
Right.
that they had spent an afternoon in the Fort Lauderdale area golfing, and then who should show up at the clubhouse or wherever Gleason was spending the night but President Richard Nixon. Now, for those of your viewers who would say, well, how could the president, show up, unannounced? Well, lest we forget, President Harry Truman got a speeding ticket while racing to a meeting at the White House in Washington, D.C. And we all remember how Bill Clinton used to, slip certain Secret Service agents, whatever, to loan him a car for an evening as he would disappear, that type of thing. So again, there's nothing unusual about it, especially back then. So Nixon wanted to show Gleason something, that no one else had really ever seen before, and he just wanted to take him into his confidence. And so they arrive at Homestead Air Force Base, and they go to—
That's in Florida.
Florida, and they go to a level, and they go to what it seemed like an underground facility. There they are, underground facility, and Gleason is shown a body, clearly non-human, whether it was cryogenically preserved, but nonetheless, I mean, he was shown what he clearly, saw as something from another world. And not much was mentioned about the situation. I mean, the president allowed, the visual to speak for itself. And according to Gleason's wife, he was pretty shook over the entire ordeal, that he didn't eat for days, and that he finally admitted, he finally told her what had transpired. And with the proviso that she couldn't say anything. So Gleason is dying. He's at a hospital in Fort Lauderdale. And I'm talking to Paul Harvey. I'm in his office in Chicago because Paul Harvey had also been a regular golfing partner with Jackie Gleason. So I'm telling him the whole story, and it's like, we need to quickly get a deathbed. We need to get him on the record, obviously. So Harvey was right on it. Well, by the time, and as things were getting arranged at the hospital, Gleason had already slipped into a coma, and we lost. We lost the chance of a lifetime. But lest we just dash it under the rug is one of those rumors that has never been substantiated. Let's at least acknowledge a number of facts. Dwight Eisenhower, 5-star general, 5-star. There's only a handful throughout the entire history of the United States. He was chief of staff of the Army in 1947 when Roswell happened.
Looks like a frozen computer again. Let me just see if this is, I'm not sure if this is coming through. Donald, we're going to have to take you out. I'm going to ask people in the chat right now, is it frozen? Appears to be. All right. So I'm going to pull Don out, and hopefully he will come back in. Let's see. So we'll wait for Donald. Yep, he's going to come back in. And I apologize, everyone. I don't really know what's going on. So I will ask if we do have the phone lines open. Chanel, I can take some calls if not. Oh, it's getting booted up right now. Thank you for that. So just a couple of things. This is a picture of Paul Harvey. These aren't, I don't know why these pictures aren't coming up very well, but this is Paul Harvey. He used to have a show on every day. My mother was a big fan way back in the day. And he used to always end his shows like, "This is Paul Harvey. Good day." That was probably a really bad imitation. And here's a picture, of course, of Jackie Gleason. As you can see, always has a cigarette in hand. And Richard Nixon at a golf course. Going back. So this is the Jim and Coral Lorenzo. As Don mentioned them early on in his research. These are the two that inspired him. So let's see if we have the phone lines are ready. So while we're waiting for Donald to come back, if you'd like to give a ring, I would love to hear from you. And that number is up on the screen, 855-472-5483. Please give a call. These things just seem to happen. The phone lines are wide open here. And please give us a ring at 855-472-5483. I do believe that this actually happened last week as well. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to be on a couple of different shows tomorrow, that is, and one of them is Darcy Weir. I do believe it's the same time. I know he does a show live somehow on Twitter. I'm not really sure how that works, but it's also here on KGRA radio as well. And Chanel, I do believe it's 8 p.m. Yes, 8 p.m. Eastern is when that's on. And but we have Chanel standing by for a phone call. And I'd love to hear from you. And I see. So Chanel, I'll see her tomorrow. Also, she's producing that show with Darcy Weir. So check out that show. That'll be here. And also, I'll try to put up a link on my Twitter, which is Podcast UFO. So if anyone wants to watch that live, and I think how he does it is he takes questions from the audience live on Twitter, and I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I'll know after tomorrow, and hopefully we'll hear back from Donald. But for now, I'd love to hear from someone. Look, there's getting 162 people right now live. Someone must have something they want to say. Tell me about a UFO sighting. If anyone has any information on the drones, I'd love to hear more about that. And numbers up on the screen, 855. Don't make me beg now, 472-5483. And I did mention earlier, just saying it again, Ryan Graves is going to be here. I'm not going to be able to take any calls next week during that show. He's going to be right here in studio. And so that should be I love having, that type of situation. And so I've got some equipment all ready for that and looking forward to that next week. And still no callers. Someone's got to call in. Maybe I'll call someone. And I asked Donald Schmitt for his number. I didn't get it. I never got it back from him. Let me just see if I have any message from him. And I don't. So we don't want to make this a short show. So I know people probably weren't. Okay, thank goodness. I'm going to congratulate this guy for calling because we have Jason on the line. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hi, you also call me Doc as well.
But, yes, Doc. Hey, I gotta say thank you so much for saving the show tonight.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Just thought I get free calls to the United States, so that's why I'm calling.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So you're in the UK. Yeah. Yes.
I've
seen you in chat. You're in a lot of the shows. I appreciate the fact that you watch these live. It's pretty late there for you.
It's midnight at the moment. I don't always get a chance to watch. I tend to listen to the podcast if I can. there's work sometimes. I have to be up at like 3:30 in the morning to get to London for work, so it's difficult, you know. There was one of your recent ones I didn't watch on purpose because I actually know the person who was on it, and I have a very low opinion of them. I'm not going to. I just wanted to just tell you. I did send you an email about it with a link.
Yeah, I think you should. Yes, I just want to say Donald did make it back. Don, hi, I see you down there. We'll get back to you right after this phone call. Okay. All right. Yeah, keep going.
I don't want to, you know, because you've had guests on, and I had an experience with one of the people you've had on, and I did email you and tell you what happened with me around that person. They actually only live a mile from where I live, less than a mile actually, and I was like kind of like disheartened. I mean, I love the show, but some people I find are just on this whole UFO thing to self-promote and using it as a way of promoting themselves rather than actually moving the cause forward.
I understand. And there's, I believe I do see. Yes, I do remember that email, and I do know who you're talking about exactly. So yeah, I understand. You know, I have opinions also that I've been a little bit more lenient with my opinions of certain people. When I look at the overall of what they do or what they have done for the UFO world, I'm not going to name any names, but I will tell you that, you know, I had this one opinion about this one single person that's in the public eye a lot, on a lot of shows and things like that. So I had an opinion, and then it was not a good opinion. And after meeting them in person and being at and hearing them talk and having an interview, I realized that there was more positive than negative. So that's kind of how, you know, I mean, I have an open mind to these things. There are people in this, you know, field, unfortunately, that are, and not too many, luckily, but there are a couple of people in the UFO topic that I would call more along the grifter type of situation, but not many. There's a lot of people that really sincerely do have an interest in moving forward and trying to figure out what these things are. Just met with someone earlier today that's in the antique and auction business, and he's like, what are these things? You know, he wants to know. So, but anyway, continue.
Yeah, I just appreciate what you do, and appreciate you bring current and relevant things to us as viewers. And I know a lot of people like to listen, but they don't like to have the same involvement as like someone like myself does. Because I'm actually a documentary maker, although I've never done anything about UFO. I've never done anything about UFOs, but because I feel the market is quite flooded with some excellent documentaries, and I couldn't do anything on the level that I see. And they're the people who have got the right connections and talking to the right people that make these documentaries. Whereas my stuff is more for about the British film industry. So that's the stuff I do, is about the British film industry. It's not to do with UFOs. I'd love to do something. If anyone's out there, what I would love to do is something on remote viewing. I'd love to do a documentary on that, but I've not had any chance. I did email you about that, and the guy answered my question when he come on. I found him very, very interesting as well.
If you ever do that, I did have someone that was involved in, what was it called in the 1970s? I do have his contact information. He's been on. I just can't. His name escapes me right now. But if you ever do that, just reach out to me, and I will connect you. If the gentleman is still with us, I should say. He's an older gentleman, for sure. But anyway, I really appreciate you saving the show and call it.
I'll send you an email in the next couple of days. All right.
Doc. Thanks, all right, Doc. Take care now.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you. All right, we may do. There was a little stuttering and stammering, but we may do.
And it completely crashed. I mean, not just the server, but I had to reboot everything.
Wow, you know, it happened last week to my guest as well. Very, very strange. I think you haven't had any Men in Black knock at your door or anything like that, have you?
No.
Yeah. No, it's been very strange. And I have to tell you, because I'm trying to make this thing work and everything, I really forget what exactly you were saying when you all of a sudden went like that.
Well, I was talking about President Eisenhower and that, the whole situation with Jack Gleason and the fact that Eisenhower, in his own memoirs, he complained that even as a 5-star general, even as the commander-in-chief, that after he became president, the Pentagon didn't tell him anything any longer. So there's nothing unusual about that. But I wanted to emphasize, like people would ask, well, why Richard Nixon? Well, who was Eisenhower's VP for 8 years? Richard Nixon. So if Eisenhower knew, if the president knew, I mean, why should we doubt that he wouldn't have confided to his own vice president?
Right.
And so it at least makes the whole Jackie Gleason story plausible, conceivable. Right. And then when we add the fact that Gleason becomes an associate of Dr. Hynek, he builds a home in the shape of a flying saucer.
That's right.
And when he departed, there were over 700 books, most of them UFO related, that were in his library. So something, happened. And I mean, I can't imagine, why would his wife at that time make up such a story?
That's right. Hey, Don, I have to say, these people have called in trying to rescue the show. Why don't we bring them in and see if they have a question for us?
Of course.
We have, first of all, we have Scott from Canada. We have 2 people from Canada. And let me bring in Scott here. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. How are you tonight?
I'm doing great. Thank you for trying to rescue the show. Don's here. Do you have a question for either one of us, both of us?
Actually, and thank you very much. It's nice to speak with both of you, and I appreciate that tonight. I just thought since you needed perhaps a little bit of time there, I would want to call in, and I found it interesting to comment earlier about the owls. And I just remembered that, as I recall, if I'm not mistaken, in Whitley Strieber's Communion, he addressed that about this was not uncommon, apparently, for people who were having experiences and not consciously remembering it, to see an owl in the window, or as you referred to, I think, Mr. Schmitt, the deer, were sort of common cover memories. I think they were referred to in that way, and I believe that was Strieber was addressing that in Communion, if I'm not mistaken. So I just found that very interesting, that at the last moment, there's this huge owl that showed up.
That's right. Well, don't be in any hurry. And also, just to make sure that we have our second person, Robert, on the line, because Don just disappeared again. This time he didn't freeze, he just vanished.
I don't want to take up your guest is the focus tonight. That's most important, obviously, for you. And but if you had a minute or two and you wanted to hear about an experience, I'd be happy to briefly relay it to you.
Sure, I'd like to hear that. And our next guest has a comment about the drones, so I'm interested in talking to him as well. So yes, I'd like to hear it.
Sure. So long time ago for me, I was in my early 20s. I used to live in southern Ontario, in the Niagara region, about an hour and a half south of Toronto. Grew up there. So a friend of mine and I were just out one night having a coffee, and late at night we went heading back home along like a regional type road, 50-mile-per-hour road with field and trees on either side next to you to kind of go from town to town. So this was probably around midnight or so, and my friend was driving. I noticed that there was sort of a glow started to appear inside our car. It was as though it was a very, very bright full moon, but brighter than any full moon I had seen, as far as what I was starting to notice sort of like a whitish light. It wasn't like it was any, extreme, focused beam or nothing like that. But it made me, I was looking at my clothes and my hands and the dashboard and thought, well, what is so bright? And I'm looking out the windshield and looking up to see, thinking, well, this can't just be a full moon because it's never that bright, even on the brightest and clearest of nights. So I saw today, I guess we would refer to this maybe as an orb, but it was a white sphere. It was traveling, pacing our car, and it was just above the tree line. The tree line was right next to us, right next to this regional road. So just at the top of the trees, it was pacing the vehicle. It kind of went a little faster than us so that it was sort of in front of us, just off to the left. Hardly high up in the sky, as I say, just above the top of the treetops. And it was a pure white, I would say, I've always wondered the size, like just something like the size of maybe a beach ball or maybe a little bigger. And it just went along and stayed there. And I thought, I've got to see this thing with my eyes and not just through a windshield. I just thought, I want to see this directly. I'm the passenger. I put the window down and I sort of hang out the window and look right at it. And then it just started to kind of lose its speed and we kept going. And it went back behind the tree line and off out over a field. And I begged my friend to go back. I said, we've got to see, did this thing land or crash? Like, what is it? And but he was quite afraid, actually. It really spooked him. I was fascinated by it, and he was spooked by it. And I was glad, just to briefly say that he was a very good friend of mine, and he's the most grounded guy I know. He has no interest in UFOs. He doesn't think about it. He doesn't care about it. It's not in his bubble, so to speak. He was not that kind of guy. I always thought these things were very interesting, very cool. But I sort of was pleased that I thought, well, if I had to see this with anybody, it's sort of like the most grounded person who could care less also saw this with me. He was the driver, I was the passenger. So he never did go back. And I've always wondered about that. It was a fascinating experience. And thank you for giving me the time just to relay that to you. And I see your guest is back as well.
Yes, we have Don is back.
If I may quickly
sure.
comment, your caller just made an excellent point about no prior interest. And that was something, again, that Dr. Hynek always emphasized, that you not only go back to the scene of the crime to have them recreate the experience, the witnesses involved, but you also go to their home. If you are able to sit down in their front room and you see a whole shelf of UFO books, well, they're rather contaminated. They're rather coached on the subject.
Yeah.
And
Good
then,
point. Yeah.
but you ask, what were you thinking of at the very time of the sighting? If you're out stargazing, hoping to see something, well, eventually, a good chance you will. But as the caller just mentioned, the idea that there was no prior interest whatsoever, that, again, this was something that just happened to kind of break the silence for the moment. And it makes the experience all the more profound. And that is the last thing they expected at that moment.
And it was profound, and you're absolutely right. That's an excellent way to describe it.
It makes for a good case report, a good sighting, yes.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate the call.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Enjoy your show, Mr. Martin.
Well, and I apologize for all the early
what's
sound
going
offs.
on with it? Yeah. Did it crash the same way?
Same way.
Wow.
Same way.
So I guess we'll have the phone number standing by here, but I really want to talk to Robert. Robert, you there? Welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. Hi, Martin. Hi, Dad.
So I see that you wanted to mention something about the drone, so I'd like to hear what you have to say real quickly, and then we'll get back to Donald and I.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really buy a government explanation that these are maybe China drones or some foreign drones. I think it's kind of a false flag operation. I think the government is deliberately flying these drones up there, kind of mixing up, subterfuging the real UFO because they don't want us to see the real thing. So the public is constantly seeing these drones like a Thinking drones, they're not going to question weird orbs or some legitimate UAPs, because if these are real foreign drones, you would have think they would have shot them down by now. They're not going extremely fast. They're not really sophisticated. Some have even flown over Trump's golf course. You will figure, my God, this is going over the future's present golf course. They could have shot it down easily, and they've gone over other military installations. They could have shot it down. So for me, I think the government, whatever you want to call it, deep state, is deliberately doing this to kind of hide things, to kind of like use as a camouflage for the real UFOs. I don't know if you guys would buy that theory.
Yeah, I mean, it makes as much sense as about anything else. But I'm going to take you off the air, but I want to thank you very much for the call, and we'll discuss it a little further here.
Yeah, and I certainly would agree. The idea that they're playing this up to the point that they're, suggesting that we're dealing with an advanced technology that is something beyond the pale, that they can't do anything about it. And lest we forget that for all the branches of the military, they really don't work together. They seldom really cooperate with one another. And there's a long history of where they have tested their technologies as far as on one another, unbeknownst to one branch or the other. And I think the classic, the best example was during Desert Storm, and it was General as far as Norman Schwarzkopf, who was Chief of Staff of the Army at that time, and he was having his daily briefing, and they were getting ready to go into Baghdad, and Schwarzkopf was complaining that none of the services were speaking between themselves, and where the Air Force was claiming air supremacy over Iraq that very first evening, and that the Navy was still lobbing tomahawks off the shore, as far as from the Mediterranean into Iraq, and the Army has no idea they should be marching into downtown Baghdad or not, because no one's on the same page. So this may again be a more contemporary example of where, who knows, it could easily be, the Navy, experimenting with drones over Air Force facilities and really having a good time about the fact that they're essentially spooking the Air Force, and it's some of our own drones. So I hardly think that they're off the planet.
It's hard to say. And, there's the sphere drones, which are pretty bizarre. I've been sent a few pictures of that. I'm going to look more into it. But I want to shift gears a little bit here, just because, we're going to be off of KGRA in, like 7 minutes or something, like 8 minutes. But one of the title to this show is, here we are, 77 years after Roswell, going on 78 years. And I want to, I don't know how many of the listeners know this, but you actually did talk with witnesses as they're living, like 20 years ago. You were speaking to
over
lots
600,
and lots, 600
witnesses, either directly or indirectly involved to date. And we are still tracking down families whose fathers, whose uncles, mothers, aunts, that type of thing, were personally involved. We've accumulated to date over 30 deathbed testimonies, invariably all, stating days, hours before their passing that it did happen, just as we have recounted, within our own books. The sworn affidavits, the video depositions, all as we've had judges, we've had lawyers just over and over again that we could take this in any court of law and win hands down. Because after all, who put out that very first press release claiming that they had captured a flying saucer?
Right. Yeah.
United States Army, Army Air Corps.
Why would they put it out at all? Why?
Yeah.
They didn't have to put it out.
They started this. And the idea that, well, this is a conspiracy. No. It's a cover-up of the fact that they first announced that. And then within 5 hours, they explained it all away as a Rowan weather target balloon, neoprene rubber, reflective foil, wooden stick, string, and tape, off-the-shelf material any 5-year-old would recognize. And then in 94, they come out with a third explanation, that being Project Mogul, Same balloon material, just that it was
Yeah.
part of a Russian spy program at that time. And then 3 years later, addressing all the accounts regarding the bodies, they come up with the anthropomorphic wooden crash dummies, which were Project High Dive, Project Excelsior, which
that
did
was
not
years
originate
later.
till 5 years after Roswell.
Right.
So, like the case, I love the fact here we are all these years later, Martin, and still, yeah, it's very sad. I go back to Roswell, and all those witnesses are gone.
Yeah.
All those firsthand friends who were brave enough to go on the record and tell us exactly what happened, all gone. But now their sons and daughters and their grandchildren. And the fact that it hasn't degraded, it hasn't broken down since, that the storyline remains the same. That what I held in my hands, what I saw out there out in that high desert arroyo, was not from planet Earth, as Major Jesse Marcel, the head of intelligence at Roswell at that time, the Roswell Army Airfield. And
Now, what would you say, the things, what happens in a lot of cases like this, and I'm sure you're very well aware about this, that some things take on a story of their own. It becomes like part of the story when it's really not part of the story. Is there anything you can, right off the top of your head, you can say that, was perpetuated and that really you feel is false?
Oh, we've had, whether it be Frank Kaufman and the fact that, he was on the base in Roswell in 47, but that he had forged documents. He had done, as far as cut and paste stuff, he changed details of the case. He essentially tried to change the date, change the locations. It was as though that was his function, was his job, to mind the store. And the next time somebody would come nosing around, well, you can't shut them down. You can't stop them, but you divert them. You distract them. So Kaufman was a prime example of that. And then you had, so-called witnesses such as Gerald Anderson, which just falsified, the entire level of their involvement. But these are the ones that typically are easy to discern in that they come to you. They're the ones that, oh, you forgot about me. Whereas the legitimate ones are the reluctant ones. They're not looking for notoriety. They're not reaching out, looking for fame and fortune. Their typical first reaction was always, how did you find me? Who told you about me? And why do you think I know anything? So there was always this level of resistance that we typically had to. In some cases, it took us a couple of years to finally break through and get some of the better witnesses to confide. So the notion that there have been a lot of hoaxes, no, you can count them on one hand as far as false witnesses. But overall, it's amazing in that it doesn't matter if you're talking about the highest ranking officer down to witnesses who were children back at that time. The story is consistent. They're all reading from the same script. And the idea that the military are describing precisely what the civilians are is one of the things that has always amazed me, because the military does not take in the civilian for any secret project of any sort. They just they draw the line. No civilians are to see anything of a sensitive nature.
Let me just say goodbye to everyone over at KGRA Radio. Thank you so much. Remember, we'll be back next week with Ryan Graves, and we'll see. Keep your eyes to the sky and all that stuff. Okay. So, but I have a lot of questions I'd like to really dig in when it comes to this topic and Roswell, because and when I say I want to separate some things, okay, these are just things I've heard, okay, over the years. About 60 miles away, there was another part of a craft, maybe a escape pod that supposedly crashed, and a geological college team of people supposedly came upon it. Is this all true? Is this all? What are these? What's real? What's not?
One of the things that always, intrigued us about the eyewitness testimony, especially in regards to the local law enforcement and the local fire department, the debris field, which started the entire, incident, and it was the ranch foreman W.W. Brazo, who on that Sunday, July 6th, when he made the long 75-mile trek in the Roswell to report this, he doesn't go to the military, he goes to the courthouse. And it's the sheriff, George Wilcox, who then would dispatch a couple of deputies to go look into it. And then Wilcox himself would go check out the location as well. Well, the debris field is up in Lincoln County, 75 miles northwest of Roswell. How is it that you had the sheriff's department go into another county out of their jurisdiction without any authority? And
now they're only supposed to do that if they're in chase. Exactly.
And then it gets handed off, and then they're asked to continue pursuit or stay involved. It's no different than a fire department when it becomes a third or fourth alarm. You call in all the outside help you can get. Okay, fine. And then when we also were hearing that the fire department was involved, that there were two specific firemen, one by the name of Dan Dwyer and one by the name of Ed Reeves, who also were out there. Well, they weren't at the debris field. The more information we were acquiring, we were finding out that there was a site much closer to Roswell, within their jurisdiction, within Chavez County, 35 miles just north of town. And this is where, from all the eyewitness accounts of both military and civilian, was this pod, this egg-shaped capsule about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle.
That's what I've heard, yeah.
And that's where there were two bodies recovered, and from all accounts, the survivor, the lone survivor. So you do have multiple sites, but one crash, one incident.
So with that, so it was one crash and a separated pod.
Yes.
Pardon me. A separated pod, possibly? Is that what we're talking about?
The flight cabin, the fact that it was only the size of a Volkswagen Beetle.
Yeah.
That was the term that a number of the witnesses used, that it was egg-shaped. So we...
like Socorro, people think of the egg-shaped craft in Socorro. Someone brought that up in the chat. They want to ask you about that.
We assigned, that very description, that it was egg-shaped based on all the accounts. But in assuming that it could very well have been, the flight cabin, an escape pod, and why was it separated by that many miles?
Right.
Unless it certainly couldn't have been by the percussion of the explosion. It was as though it was jettisoned, as though it was, actually deployed for that distance.
I remember
impacting north of Roswell.
Pardon me. I remember Stanton Friedman at one time thought there may have been a collision between two crafts.
Right.
You don't believe that?
No, because he was trying to still draw in. If you remember, Martin, the very first book on Roswell, the Roswell Incident by Berlitz and Moore. Yep. And the only account they had pertaining to bodies at that time was Barney Barnett. And Barnett worked in Socorro, which is another 100 miles west of the Corona debris field location. And that it supposedly was something that he witnessed out on the plains of San Augustine, where the famous Bat Cave is located, that archaeologists were exploring at that time. We had tracked down all the archaeologists who were still alive, who were working throughout that region during that summer of 47. And then Gerald Anderson came along, and he claimed that, it was further west around Horse Springs, around the Dado area. And so Friedman, in trying to essentially put it all together, well, we can have a craft just north of Roswell and then a debris field 27 miles to the northwest of there. So then he tried to tie in the plains of San Augustine 2 hours further to the west as a separate craft, that there was a collision. It was strictly a theory on his part. But we, and when I say we, I'm talking specifically Tom Carey and myself, we spent much more time out on the plains and through that region, tracking down every rancher, every hired hand, everyone who resided through that region back in 47. And we could not so much as find a third-hand witness to anything happening out there.
Now, why do you think this is kept quiet from 1947 all the way to, what was it, 1980 or whatever year it was? Why do you think no one really came forward about it? Do you think it's because they were scared to talk about it?
They were threatened. We have many, whether military or civilian, that were the military. They were threatened as far as a lifetime imprisonment, and specifically Leavenworth. Wow. You know, the name of that prison came up over and over again, that if you say one more word about this, you know, you're going to spend out the rest of your living days in Leavenworth. And then they had, you know, loss of pension and benefits if they were officers, because they would be breaking a security oath. And then with the civilians, which was, you know, the true dilemma that they faced, and that, well, you can't order civilians to do anything unless martial law be declared, but you can certainly threaten them. And whether it was fireman Dan Dwyer's daughter, Frankie Rowe, or whether it was the mortician, whether it was the sheriff, whether it was his deputies, whether it was the newspaper, whether it was the radio station, they were all threatened into silence. They were all threatened into submission. The radio station, KGFL, Judd Roberts was a minority owner at the radio station at that time. And he took the phone call right from the FCC, and it was TJ Slowey, who we confirmed. He was vice president at the FCC at that time, and he calls up the radio station and tells them they're going to lose their license in 24 hours if they put the story out. Well, wow. You know, it's First Amendment. How do you shut down the press? But yet they did. I mean, they resorted to such extreme measures over a weather balloon. And to me, Martin, that's what always, you know, rubbed me. Like, okay, you know, we can accept that it was the mundane, but they didn't behave in a mundane fashion.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this, because this is the biggest puzzle to me. And I've said it before to people that are skeptical about Roswell. And that is, and we talked about it briefly, why on earth did they put that story out in the first place?
Yes. I've written entire chapters on how the press release was choreographed. It was staged. And for this reason, Brazel, the ranch foreman, brings the material into town, brings it into Roswell on Sunday, early Sunday afternoon, July 6th. It's the sheriff who notifies the base, the Roswell Army Airfield, headquarters of the first atomic bomb squadron in the world, the 509th Bomb Wing. And who should he actually speak with but the very head of intelligence, Major Jesse Marcel? Well, Marcel retrieves a box of the wreckage brought in by the rancher, takes it back to the base, and it's important enough that he alerts the very base commander, Colonel William Blanchard. Mm-hmm. And Blanchard, in handling the wreckage, he immediately dispatches not only Marcel, but the head of counterintelligence, Captain Sheridan Cabot. Cabot specializes in foreign espionage, CIC, counterintelligence. So they're suggesting that if it's something of foreign design, that should be his expertise. But in both cases, he sends out the two head of intelligence. He's not just sending out a couple of grunts to humor the rancher or go check this out. So it continues to escalate in importance by the moment. Well, then who does Blanchard immediately contact? He contacts his boss, his ranking officer, and that was Brigadier General Roger Ramey, head of the 8th Air Force at Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth. Well, Ramey is in Denton, Texas at that time for the dedication of a new plane. He's also with family. It's the 4th of July holiday weekend. So his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas J. DuBose, takes the phone call. DuBose then immediately contacts Washington. He contacts the Pentagon. According to DuBose, who I interviewed personally in his home in Orlando, Florida, on 3 separate occasions, and then numerous times over the phone, he described that within an hour, General Clements McMullen, who was Deputy Director of Strategic Air Command at the Pentagon, immediately calls and says, you have Blanchard, have some of that wreckage immediately flown to your attention at Fort Worth, and that Al Clark, who was the base commander at Carswell, should bring it directly to Washington. The point being, Martin, that Washington already has the actual wreckage, some of the actual wreckage in their possession by late evening, Sunday, July 6th. Okay? When does the press release go out? Noon, Tuesday, July 8th. Full day and a half later. They had plenty of time. This was no knee-jerk reaction where somebody overreacted.
Wow.
The press release is worded very specifically. It claims that they already had the disc in their possession. No need to go look out, anywhere. We have it. When in reality, there was a whole debris field still out there, which would take troops, 50 to 60 troops, 3 full days to clean up.
Well, let's just pause there for just one quick second.
Yeah.
So when they say a disc, would that be the egg-shaped part of the craft when they're claiming disc?
No.
Okay.
They're talking about strictly the debris field.
Okay.
And it talks about that. It mentioned that the rancher stored it in a livestock shed. That livestock shed was still out there till about 15 years ago. We've been to it. We've taken many a picture of it. And the testimony was always that very first evening after Brazel discovered the wreckage early that morning, that later that evening, after alerting all his neighbors and who can identify this material, has anybody ever seen anything like this before? And he contacted the county sheriff's department in Lincoln County. He went into Corona. If anybody could help him, he made a phone call at the general store there, which we've also confirmed. He called up his boss, J.B. Foster, who owned the ranch, who had a main ranch in western Texas at that time. And so they were all contacted as Brazel was trying to, who's responsible for a mile's length of debris out here? And nobody can identify this stuff. Well, Brazel, that first evening, he drives back with his pickup truck and he drags the largest piece that had created a 10-foot wide gouge that went on for hundreds of feet. And he stored it in that livestock shed just 3 miles to the north of that debris field. That's what the press release was referring to. It made it seem like it was all a nice, tightly bundled and wrapped, package that all they needed to do was come out and retrieve it. And so they weren't lying, but just that they referred to it as the disc. Now
I see.
Okay. Now I also quickly point out there's only one person named in the press release. Major Marcel. And where's Major Marcel? He's ordered onto a B-29 bomber called Dave's Dream with the 715 Bomb Squadron. and he's on his way to Fort Worth. So he's not available for any remarks, any commentary. Brazel has been kidnapped by the base, and Colonel Blanchard announces he's going on leave, which in reality, as Colonel Joseph Briley, who was his head of operations, told us, that was a blind, as he called it, that in reality, he was setting up a base of operation out at the crash site, the impact site just north of town. See, in many ways, Martin, the press release also serves as a beautiful diversion from the site that is much more sensitive just north of town with the ship and the bodies. Because wreckage you can explain away, but non-human bodies. So you can see where it all, then becomes part of that subterfuge. And the other thing I should quickly mention is that when the press release went out, the Christian Monitor newsletter published the minute-by-minute bulletins from Associated Press from the time the press release went out, and then you see minute by minute the evolution into the weather balloon. I point this out because originally Washington, D.C. is also exchanging those date lines where it's originally claimed to be a flying saucer.
Wow.
And it worked masterfully.
Right.
I mean, it was wonderful gamesmanship, but it was high risk, but they got away with it. And so,
where would you suppose, this is generational now, and legacy debris is at this point?
We've had first-hand witnesses. There's nothing left at Wright Pat. We were told by a full bird years ago, and then even I know he's a former deputy commander at Wright Pat, and his name is Colonel Jeffrey Thau, War College, dear friend, and that everything was moved out in the early 80s. The full bird told us that we're right in the middle of Dayton. We had a hell of a time bringing things in, and we had a hell of a time getting things out. But we finally realized, we gotta skip town. We got to get out of here. So we've had to date first-hand witnesses at Boeing, at Lockheed Martin, at Battelle, at Rand, at Hughes, GE, Los Alamos, all talking about attempts at reverse engineering the wreckage. And so I am more and more of the opinion that just as Eisenhower had, warned all of us about the military-industrial complex.
Yes.
That's where, they hold all the secrets. That in many respects, the military has lost control of what they originally, were placed in charge. And as a result, the old order did not pass it down to the new. And I'm sitting at the Pentagon today going, they're demanding that we disclose all this, and we don't even know where it is today.
Right.
And the military complex, they are exempt from FOIA. From freedom
because of security reasons?
Security reasons. And so remember what I mentioned earlier, the fact that Eisenhower, in his memoirs, complained that once he became president, he didn't get any answers any longer. And so I think that's why he became so frustrated with these corporations. And we're beholden to them because, as we both realize, government doesn't manufacture a single bullet. Plane, ship, boat, it's all, assimilated into the private sector. And that's what they needed to do with Roswell. They had to assimilate it into the private. With
no oversight.
Somebody finding the on button.
Right. Yeah, I've always thought, for these things to make sense that they exist, there could be no oversight, congressional oversight over these things, and that's how they can get away with it. And when they brought up in those, I'm trying to think what it was. They were trying to pass this thing, and I guess it failed again this year too. But one of them was eminent domain of
Yes.
whatever it is, and that may have been just the too far to go.
It was a ploy. It was kind of we're failing at every other avenue.
Yeah.
And first we invite them to come up to Capitol Hill, and we were telling the press at that time, the Pentagon never sends anyone up to the Hill who could accidentally tell the truth. It's always underlings, it's always nobodies, or people that have never had access. They may even be, high ranking, but it doesn't mean that they have access to the data.
Yeah.
If it's not their purview, why should they know anything about it? It was one of the amusing things about with Project Mogul, the fact that they assigned at the time Captain James McAndrew, who was in the reserves. And again, he has no clearance, no access, and yet he becomes the expert on Project Mogul. So no matter who he talks to, there's no way he can accidentally slip.
I see.
And say anything contrary to what the only subject that he's the master of. And so that's where, these congressional, committees, they're making the mistake of going to the wrong people. They should be subpoenaing as far as people like the Musks and the Riches and the Richard Bransons and others that the Robert Bigelow. Why hasn't Bigelow, been put on the hot seat?
Right. He claims he knows more about than any other private citizen.
And I can tell you firsthand, he was with us in New Mexico on a number of occasions because he was becoming interested in Roswell and he wanted to be part of it initially. And then he saddled up with Friedman, and he was funding a lot of Stan's research at that time. But it was a bit of a kind of like a race to the moon, so to speak, that we were competing from our end, and Stan and Bigelow and others were working from their end. And I'm sorry that Bigelow came away with a bad taste in his mouth, and he's kind of washed his hands of the whole thing. And then after the whole abduction thing with Bud Hopkins and the Roper poll, where they spent all that money just to conduct a survey, how many people believe they've been abducted? And again, what type of research is that? That's just someone, licking their finger and, okay, which way is the wind blowing? No answers.
So I'm going to ask you a couple of other questions that,
Yeah.
have come to mind, and how truthful you think they are. And that is, what about the supposed nurse, I believe it is, who all of a sudden she was gone from there.
Right.
Is that a true story? And about the coffins too, the child-sized coffins.
Yes.
Those are a couple of questions.
Excellent. Okay. The nurse. Glenn Dennis was the mortician at the Ballard Funeral Home at that time. We met Glenn for the first time back in 1990, that fall. And Glenn went on camera, our very first documentary. CNN did the post-production. And there Glenn was telling the story about this nurse, and that he gave us the name of Naomi Self. Well, nobody spent more time trying to, first of all, confirm there was ever a nurse by that name, and then trying to tie her up with Glenn's description that she looked like a young Audrey Hepburn, black hair, beautiful black eyes, that she had considered going into the sisterhood, a convent, prior to going into as far as the Army Nursing Corps, and devout Catholic, that type of thing, and that she was then transferred off the base in Roswell shortly after the incident, outside of a base facility out of London, and that her and a number of other nurses were killed in a plane crash, shortly thereafter. Okay.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, Glenn was having an affair with that nurse back at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And because his previous wife was still alive, and his wife at that time, he chose the gentleman thing to do and not mention and not name her publicly. Well, we confirmed who she was, and that was Adeline Fatton. And her picture, she looks like a young Audrey Hepburn.
Hmm.
And the Air Force also confirmed that, yes, she was transferred to England shortly after the incident. There was never a plane crash. We proved that ourselves. There was never a plane crash involving any nurses. But she would die just a few years after the transfer of a childhood disease.
Oh.
So that all at least came together. But the fact that Glenn misinformed us about the name and everything, I know like Kevin Randle, my first partner, and others had just totally, written him off. But the things that have been proven to be true, we just can't deny. We just can't claim that, well, Glenn just, serendipitously came up with, that information. There was a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
She was transferred. And on top of it, she had considered going into the sisterhood earlier.
Wow.
So, and then regarding the child-sized coffins, we tracked down the son of the contract truck driver who used to go up to Amarillo, where he would make a regular coffin run. That's where the coffins were constructed. According to the son, there was an urgent call they had to, at the time of, that it hit the newspapers that they had recovered a flying saucer. Next thing, he's with his father, and they're making a quick trip up to Amarillo. And when they return back to Roswell, it's all cordoned off from the east as they approached from Texas. They had to circle to the west, so they managed to get to their home. And according to the son, he's dropped off at home, and then his father went on, not to the Ballard funeral home, but out to the base to drop off a number of coffins. Now, whether they were child size, that always, became part of, the legend, so to speak, that the request came specifically for child size coffins. But the fact that we have a firsthand who was witness to the fact there was a coffin as far as delivery that came in and went directly out to the base. Now, mind you, the base at that time did not have a morgue. They were on contract with the Ballard funeral home. And so the phone calls from the base hospital to the Ballard also would have been consistent because they were on contract. We need coffins. And then what can we use for the preservation of tissue, of bodies that have been exposed to the elements for an extended period of time? So there too, there's no breakdown in that, chain of activity.
I see. All right, let me ask you this. What do you think it's, what is it, the greater sum of the parts, or however that saying goes? Is it like the whole thing together, segments of Roswell that you think are much more compelling, or a particular witness? What really, really drives it home for you to think this was a real event?
Specifically to the deathbeds. And not that I wasn't convinced 99% at that point, but witnesses we had talked to, high-ranking officers, one being the very, as far as provost marshal, and that was Major Edwin Easley, and then the base adjutant, who was Captain Patrick Saunders. Easley, when Kevin Randle called him after we had discovered his location down in Texas, and we have him on tape over and over again stating, I can't talk about that. I am still sworn to secrecy. Now, mind you, this is 45 years after the incident, and making that statement over and over again. And then Kevin would ask, well, we're writing a book. May we send you a copy? And maybe you'll see where others are speaking to us that you may be more inclined to at least comment. So we send him a copy. We waited some months. We called him right from the office of the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. And Kevin, again, easily, I'm sorry, I still can't talk about this. And then Kevin makes the comment, well, at the time, he's Lieutenant Colonel. So Kevin, Colonel, you see the direction we're going. You see the direction the eyewitnesses are going. Can you at least tell us if we're going in the right direction? There's a pause, and Easley comes back, and he says, let's just say you're not going in the wrong direction. So he could tell I didn't tell them anything.
Yeah.
I didn't admit anything. But so it was a wonderful military response. Well, anyway, Easley is dying a year later of stomach cancer at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Exactly where John F. Kennedy was.
Kennedy went, right, yes.
And in the presence of his daughters, and specifically his daughter Nancy, who was a longtime attorney in the Dallas, Fort Worth area, and I know her very well, their niece brings him a gift, holds it up to his face, and he turns away and goes, oh, this is in his hospital room. He turns away and goes, oh, the creatures. And he apologizes to his two daughters and how much he wanted to tell them, and that it was the president who had asked him never to say another word about this, and that he was going to honor that pledge, but that it did happen. It was all true. And what the granddaughter had brought her grandfather was a copy of our book.
Oh, wow.
And then quickly, with Saunders, first time I spoke to him, again, base adjutant, head of operations. And he laughed at me and he went, oh, you're talking about the men from Mars, that was all just, big hoax. Nothing ever, happened there. And it's not like he even said it was a balloon. He just said it was all of just a big hoax. Well, anyway, before he died in 1995. He fell off of a ladder and had some skull injury that he never recovered from. But nonetheless, after he passed, we learned from the family that he had bought up as many copies, paperback copies of our second book, which came out in 1994, a year earlier, of Truth About UFO Crash at Roswell. And inside the inner leaf, he wrote, this is the truth. I never told anyone before. I kept my word. And he signed it, Pat.
Wow.
So you talk about, wow.
That is amazing.
And so, and as you know, in a court of law, both admissible, physical evidence. And so, how do you, they were both lying?
Right.
To their families? Why? And again, no, people don't do that on their deathbeds. They just don't.
That's right.
And you can't dismiss.
There's no reason for
right.
someone to lie on their deathbed.
No.
They can't lose their pension.
We'd have to throw out all of them.
Yeah.
I mean, we just can't. Oh, well, I don't like the Roswell deathbeds, but we have to accept all the others. No.
Yeah.
They're either all significant or not. So.
Right. Now let's just say that there's no such thing as, people are saying disclosure or whatever. Let's just say it's kind of status quo still 50 years from now. What do you think? Where do you think Roswell will be in 50 years? Do you think, and part of this, some of the myth and the craziness happens with the event every single year, in Roswell,
oh, yes.
In July. and it gets, it gets people saying, oh, those are just a bunch of nutcases, and the stories that come from there. But where do you see Roswell as being a solid story or not 50 years from now? Just a thought.
Kevin Randle and I, we were the ones who first conceived the museum, International UFO Museum and Research Center. We were becoming, just as you described, more and more concerned that the outside opportunists would come in and exploit this, make it into a tourist trap, make it into a circus, a carnival. So we went to the city, fathers, and we were very happy that they agreed with us that there should be something that we should preserve, not only the historical relevance of the case, but the people who were involved. The fact that you had the base personnel, the first atomic bomb squadron, and then you had many of the ranchers whose names are still synonymous with those regions around Roswell. And I'd like to believe in establishing that museum. And there too, and Kevin was with me the last time that we argued before the museum's board of directors that we will come down there and take everything off the walls if you feel that this is nothing more than like the silly season that we're going to make as much money off as we can, because neither Kevin or I have ever received a dime from the museum. We've never asked for anything. We've had our archaeological digs, all the times that Kevin Randle and then Tom Carey thereafter that we were tracking down witnesses and making trip after trip after trip, not only to New Mexico, but all over the country, was out of our pockets. Right. It was at a time that Kevin and I were running up phone expenses of $1,000 a month between the two of us.
Jeez.
Tracking down and interviewing every last witness. And the museum would just as soon show us the door, because they love the fact that, it generates a lot of revenue, not only for the museum, but the city.
Right.
Well, Kevin and I and Tom can honestly say, but we're not party to that. We are only interested in the historic preservation of the case. And I'll just mention this right now, Martin. If I have to start another museum at some point for that sole, mission on our part, we will do that. And as long as we still have influence and as long as we still have a say at the current location, we see that after we passed on, that at least that remains our legacy, and it remains the legacy of the event. That it has its own Graceland, it has its own Alamo, it has its own Holy Land. That although the players are all gone, and they've all left the stage, but the marquee, the poster, remains. Historically, the only thing that ever remains after the fact are the eyewitness accounts, the records. Right. Documents. And I, for one, I'm going to continue knocking on the door of Washington. I'm going to continue to be pressuring, Burchett and Luna and Grothman and the others involved that stop asking for documents. It's that classic scene in the movie Independence Day. Show me.
Yeah, show me the money.
I don't want to see paper anymore. Show me the damn body. Show me a piece of the memory material. Come on. Overnight. So,
right. Here, a question here. We're about ready to wrap it up here. Is there more to learn about Roswell in the future?
Well, I just finished up my last book, and now I'm waiting on the other writers. What I did was I went chapter after chapter. Violations of First Amendment, violations of civil rights, violations of due process, whether military, civilian, media, chapter after chapter, all these firsthand witnesses. And then at the end of each chapter, I have 3 attorneys citing chapter and verse of where the law was broken. I have a retired judge who's writing my foreword. The book is entitled The State versus Roswell.
Wow.
So in other words, okay, how are you going to argue the fact that the United States government threatened civilians? How are you going to argue the fact that the United States government kidnapped civilians? How are you going to argue that the United States government performed full body cavity searches on civilians looking for a piece of weather balloon?
Right.
On and on and on.
Yeah.
And so I think it's going to be our most definitive, our most, as far as it'll be Roswell's day in court, so to speak.
I love it.
And so
Yeah.
I think it's going to, really, demonstrate even to the debunker that their arguments become more and more moot as, they prey off of, failed memories of older people. And I said to one in the debate a couple of months ago, I finally said to him, I said, you're not smart enough to have all the answers on this. I'm not either. And that's the reason I'm still working on it.
Yeah.
I'm still looking for the answers.
Mhm.
Don't tell me you have all of them. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And he didn't have a response to that.
Yeah. Yeah, good one. Here's our last question here. And does the guest, do you recall a picture of a negative of an arm of one of the ETs that were shown in a documentary back by? So what can you tell us about that?
Yes. I don't know if you ever interviewed the late Len Stringfield.
No, I know of him. Yeah.
But Len was the one, if you remember, I mean, he was the one who really, at the very time that Major Marcel first went public in 1978, that Len, when he gave his famous talk about crash retrievals of the fourth kind, in other words, where they're recovering wreckage and bodies. And he came out with that in 1978 already. And Len would describe that he was handed a picture of what looks, I think it's been explained the way as almost like an amphibian, skeleton, because it's skeletal, but it looks more like a fin, but yet it still has the 5 appendages, the bone structure that would have been within a fin. And it looks alien. It looks, something, that's not quite human, so to speak. And I remember when Len acquired that, and he just published it in one of his status reports. And we would do the same thing. You put things out just to see what the reaction is. Maybe somebody has more information. Maybe somebody is aware of, the source, especially when you receive it anonymously and you want to get to the bottom of it. You just put it out on the table to see what the reaction is. And that's what Len was doing with that. And so it was pretty much explained the way. As I know anthropologists also became involved and explained it the way as that.
Excellent. Well, you didn't disappoint, Don, and it's been great to talk to you and know you all these years. I think you were one of my very first guests on my show back in 2011.
I believe I was.
I think you were in like number 4.
And look what it's all become. I mean, you're right at the top now, Martin. And the point is, who haven't you interviewed? And
well, there's Alex Dietrich. She actually agreed to be on my show. I had her phone number and everything. I really wanted her on, and I tried to. And then she said she'd be on, and she told Lou Elizondo's wife Jennifer that she would definitely be on my show and all this stuff. And then I'm trying to understand why she didn't want to come on. And then I saw her being interviewed, and she said, I don't want to be known as the UFO woman. So I understand that. But she actually went on a show with Mick West, believe it or not. So she is out there. So there's a few that I haven't. And, but anyway.
I hope she put West in his place because she lived it. She experienced it. She saw it. Nobody could take that away from her.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I was so glad when she came forward, and, she was anonymous for a long time. And then she came forward and said, basically it's me. And she's I believe she's a professor, or She's at a university. Yes.
At a university, correct. Well,
Right.
she didn't want to be typecast. So
That's right. Yeah. And podcast UFO kind of says UFO in the
well,
title.
if I can, and I know Lou very well, and his wife. I met his two daughters, and so, and I have a standing invitation to even visit with them at their
Nice.
ranch. And so
Yeah.
I'll put it in Jennifer's ear again that that of all the podcasts, you'd be one of the top ones that I would recommend. So
Well, I appreciate that very much. But anyway, it's been a real pleasure. I love this conversation tonight. I feel like, you know, I had a lot of questions that have been on my mind, and it was really great to talk to you about it. And
well, we won't wait 6 more years to continue.
That's right.
No,
that's right. All right.
Merry Christmas.
Yes, same to you. Merry Christmas.
Holidays, best for the new year, and let's do it again much sooner than later. Okay.
All right. All right.
Okay,
Don.
Martin.
All right. Good night. All right, everyone. So don't forget to tune in. Well, actually, you can tune in tomorrow. I'll be on Darcy Weir's show at 8 p.m. IGRA radio. So check that out. And next week, again, I know I've said it twice already, but Ryan Graves will be here in studio in my living room. Should be a very interesting conversation. I found out when I was talking to him in Washington, D.C., in line, we talked for, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes or something. But I said, I heard a rumor that you are in New Hampshire. Is that true? And he was actually doing his show, his podcast that he was doing right up the street, not even a quarter of a mile from me here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So that's where he was doing his show. And so he's coming right here to town, and we should have a nice one. And I thank you so much for everyone. Thank you so much for participating tonight, being in chat, and for you supporting the show. And remember, everyone, don't forget to keep your eyes to the sky. Thank you, and good night.